Tonight, two stories that show how US pressure is reshaping alliances from the Arctic to Asia. In our first segment, Denmark and Greenland's prime ministers head to Berlin and Paris to shore up European backing after President Trump's push to take over Greenland rattled transatlantic ties, turning sovereignty and Arctic security into a live test for NATO unity. Then, for our second segment, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer says Britain will not be forced to choose between the United States and China as he prepares a high-profile visit to Beijing, aimed at repairing ties and expanding trade while trying to manage the geopolitical cost. I'm Henny Saif. It's time to get in focus. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen are traveling to Berlin and Paris to shore up European support for President Donald Trump's push to take over Greenland rattled transatlantic ties. Now, Reuters reported that Frederiksen and Nielsen will meet the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in Berlin and the French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris, as Denmark and Greenland try to lock in European backing on sovereignty and Arctic security. France said Macron will reaffirm European solidarity and support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity for Denmark and Greenland, with talks expected to cover Arctic security challenges and Greenland's economic and social development. The trip follows weeks of tension after Trump pushed to take control of Greenland, then stepped back from tariff threats and ruled out using force, moving the dispute into a diplomatic track. Denmark and Greenland say they can discuss a wide range of issues with Washington, but insist their red lines are sovereignty and territorial integrity. To further unpack the situation, we're joined from Cairo by Dr. Mohammed Osman, the International Relations Specialist. Dr. Osman, welcome to In Focus. What is the real objective of this Berlin and Paris trip? Is it deterrence messaging to Washington, European Union unity, or building a longer-term European Arctic posture?
Thank you for having me, Hani. Greetings to you and to your audience. It seems that, of course, this comes as a part of a European effort to show collective solidarity with Denmark with regards to its territorial integrity and its sovereignty over Greenland, which is basically has been under Danish sovereignty since the 1800s, since the 19th century. So it is a legal part of Denmark, and the manner by which the United States has been approaching the idea of attempting to acquire Greenland is basically it contravenes the concept of sovereignty. It threatened Denmark. President Trump threatened to seize it by force, even indirectly, before backtracking and saying that the military option is not on the table. The Europeans have been united and very stern in their response. They have demonstrated that they are complete, that their stance is uniform with regards to Danish sovereignty over Greenland and the upholding of Danish sovereignty in general. And basically, the Europeans wanted to deliver a message to the Americans that any attempt to forcibly wrest control of Greenland will fracture the Western alliance, the NATO alliance, beyond repair. Prime Minister Frederiksen herself said that it would be the end of NATO if the United States attempts to take it by force. However, of course, this story is not over. And U.S. interest in Greenland does not come merely from Trump's whims, as the mainstream media sometimes would like to paint it, Henny. This is something that has been a strategic aim of the United States for arguably for over a century, since 1867, They have been interested in acquiring that, as Trump would put it, that very nice piece of real estate. And it does have it makes strategic sense why the
Hmm.
United States would want to control that region.
Well, Germany and France are mainly some of the key heavyweights of the European continent, so it is understandable why they are the key stops. But what can Berlin and Paris actually deliver beyond the statements?
They can express solidarity. They can ensure Denmark that Europe will stay united behind them. And however, when punch comes to when punch comes to blow, basically, I think that there will be something else entirely on the table, potentially, because uh, Germany and France do have different philosophies in dealing with the Trump administration at the moment. Macron, as we have seen, is much more confrontational, and this has provoked the ire of Trump and the anger of the US administration, and that's why US French relations are at an all time low. However, Germany has been much less confrontational, attempting to contain these Trump's tendencies, and how the U.S. is moving about with its commitments to the Western alliance in general, and how also it could potentially undermine the European Union, whether through attempting to wrest control of Greenland, or through the trade policy that Trump has adopted against the Europeans, which harmed the European economies, until, of course, the European Union was basically forced to ratify a trade agreement with the Trump administration, with the United States, of course, which was arguably completely unbalanced, and basically completely in the favor of Washington, D.C. However, of course, the idea that the issue of Greenland is one issue that there isn't much room for disagreement on. I think that both countries are committed, whether Germany or France, as the two heavyweights, as you said, of the European Union. They do believe that allowing the United States to just wrest control of Greenland or relinquish Greenland will have very, very dire consequences, because basically, it sets a very dangerous precedent for European countries. Russia seized Crimea in 2014, and then one-fifth of Ukraine during this current war. And this has been basically the main cause of a war by proxy between the West and Russia, because the West has been touting the idea that sovereignty and borders are inviolable and should not be changed by force. So if the United States succeeds in taking away a part of a European country, even if it's not a continental Europe, but it is under the sovereignty of a European nation, it will set a very bad precedent. So that's why the French and the Germans, in this regard, are very keen to preserve Denmark's territorial integrity at this point.
Hmm.
Will they succeed? This remains to be seen.
Macron and the German Chancellor are expected to reaffirm the sovereignty and territorial integrity, of course, of Greenland. But what practical follow-up then through can Europe offer without escalating the situation inside NATO?
I think they will try as much as possible to appease Trump. And now it seems that NATO is the framework through which negotiations are going on with regards to the Greenland issue. Mark Rutte reportedly has proposed a verbal proposal to Trump, a framework of some sort for the settlement of the Greenland issue. We haven't seen anything written or set in stone until now. We have seen that President Trump has softened his rhetoric and softened his tone with regards to his narrative on Greenland, yet he did not back down from his aims. He said that the military option is not on the table at the moment, and he also waived the tariffs, the additional tariffs that he slapped on European countries that sent a few dozen soldiers to Greenland as a move of solidarity with the Danish. However, at the same time, he did not back down from the idea of seizing Greenland, and says that he will have to have it, and that he will have to have eternal U.S. control over this humongous island. And it seems from what we have heard is that Mark Rutte and the NATO Secretariat are speaking about an arrangement that is very similar to that of British military bases in Cyprus. And that is that these American military bases, the current one that still exists, and maybe even new ones that might be established on the island, will be under American sovereignty, that they will not be part of a Danish sovereignty, and that the United States will have the ability to control them and to do as they wish with them at any time of their choosing without having to acquire the permission of Denmark. And also the US would have a veto on companies that could invest in Greenland resources. So basically it will be forfeiting most of Greenland's sovereign rights to the United States without naming it as such officially, Hani. Is this going to happen? Are the Europeans okay with this? Is Denmark okay with this? This remains to be seen.
Well, how does Europe strengthen then the Arctic security through NATO cooperation, while at the same time rejecting any politics of coercion inside the alliance?
I think we're way past this point. To be honest with you, Hani, I think that the United States will have its way at the end of the day. This is not a disagreement between equals or peers. This is a disagreement between members of the alliance and the leader of the alliance, the major power of the alliance, the superpower in the alliance, the only superpower actually in the alliance, whose force exceeds the force of the alliance combined in terms of the size of the economy or the size of its military capabilities. So I do believe that this will not be really a dialogue between two equals at this point. I think that the United States will impose its will at the end of the day. Arctic security is of the essence to the United States more than any other of these NATO countries, especially that the largest country that has a coast on the Arctic area and the North Pole is Russia. And Russia has been undertaking a lot of works in the Arctic in terms of exploiting its resources and excavation for resources. And this is something that has been very disturbing for the United States. And even there are reports that Russia might use the Arctic region for military reasons. And of course, all of this is supported by China financially, according to reports. So the United States is very concerned. Its territory in the Arctic is very limited because it's only limited to the waters of the territorial waters and the exclusive economic zone of Alaska. Having Greenland will basically extend U.S. presence in the Arctic. This is President Trump's logic. This can be achieved through NATO. However, seeing how little faith President Trump has in NATO and in multilateralism in general, and how he belittles his European allies all the time, it does make sense why he would want to go about this unilaterally and to pursue U.S. interests in the Arctic without necessarily not being necessarily under the banner or the umbrella of NATO at this point.
Mm-hmm. The prime ministers of Denmark and Greenland showed that they can still play ball with the US. They said that they can discuss many topics with the US, but sovereignty is a red line. So what does a realistic compromise look like that stays actually below that line? Are we talking about economic deals?
I think that what Mark Rutte is proposing is a combination of military concessions and economic concessions as well to the United States in return for Greenland at large remaining under Danish sovereignty in name, it seems. As I said, military bases that are under complete U.S. sovereignty, that are beyond Danish sovereignty under any shape or form, meaning that the Denmark would not have any say in how the United States utilizes these military bases, and also a U.S. veto on any economic investments in certain strategic sectors like energy, like fossil energy, like rare earths and whatnot inside Greenland. And of course, this is designed to limit existing Chinese investments in Greenland and also to prevent further Chinese or Russian investments in this island, basically. And this is what the United States want. And basically, probably also that the deal will include clauses that will give priority to U.S. companies wishing to invest in that sector in Greenland. So basically, if the United States is given these concessions while Denmark retaining sovereignty in name on Greenland, I think this might be a workable arrangement, far from being fair, far from being respecting of international law, yet it is the only workable agreement at this point because the United States, I don't think they will back down from the idea of seizing Greenland, and this is not a whim of Trump. This has been a core strategic aim of the United States for over 150 years now, and I think that they aim to accomplish it. They attempted to do so in the 1940s when President Truman, Harry Truman back then, offered to purchase Greenland from Denmark, as it was under U.S. military control back then because of World War II in 1946, and Denmark refused. And then they signed the 1951 agreement on leasing certain military bases to the United States in Greenland. Are we seeing a development? I think what we will see is developing this treaty further, or having a very similar framework that is much more overreaching and much more compromising on the ground of Danish sovereignty without declaring that as such.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Osman, we've seen the US forcing European countries to spend the 5% of their GDP on defense. Now, with this episode, do you think it's accelerating a wider European push to reduce the dependence on Washington? If so, where will we see it first? Defense spending, the Arctic assets, or just pure diplomacy?
No, I think that Europe has reckoned that there's a necessity to establish and secure their defense autonomy and self-reliance in over the next few years. And this does not go back to the Greenland issue. They reckon that this is very important with the eruption of the Russia-Ukraine war. After exhausting their stockpiles of ammunition that they gave over, and even their strategic stockpiles of weapons and ammunition that were spent in the war in Ukraine just to supply the Ukrainian army so that it wouldn't be defeated by the much more powerful Russian army. They have seen the limitations of their own military industry. They have seen how a country like Russia, whose economy is a fraction of Europe's collective economy, or even of a country like Germany, for example, outproduces them militarily in terms of military production more than beyond anyone's imagination. And this is one of the reasons why Russia has persevered so far in this war. And they've seen how the United States could be unreliable, with Trump backtracking from supporting Ukraine, with Trump attempting to push down a settlement down Ukraine and Ukraine's and Europe's throat that doesn't take into account, of course, Europe's security concerns, and also doesn't take into account Ukrainian sovereignty over the territories that have been seized by Russia. They do now see how urgent it is to expand their own defense spending. And of course, with what's going on in Greenland, this basically underlines that they really have to do this, and that they have put forward plans to increase their defense spending, and they have already started spending more on defense. The European Union is supposed to spend over the next 3 years or 4 years about what might amount to $1 trillion US on defense. And I think this demonstrates how they are aiming to establish some sort of autonomy in terms of defense and security. However, it will never be complete because the United States support and presence in Europe's security architecture is something that cannot be relinquished. And Mark Rutte even said it and admitted it yesterday, that keep dreaming if you believe that you can do without U.S. Guarantees of European security under the NATO umbrella.
Mm-hmm. From Cairo, that was Dr. Mohammed Osman, the International Relations Specialist. Dr. Osman, thank you for your valuable insights. Always a pleasure having you with us. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer says Britain will not be forced to choose between the United States and China. He highlights business opportunities ahead of a high-profile trip to Beijing. Starmer says the UK can maintain close ties with Washington while still engaging China, arguing it would not be sensible to ignore Beijing as an economic reality. The remarks come as Starmer heads to China on the first UK Prime Minister visit in years, with Reuters reporting the trip is aimed at repairing ties and boosting trade and investment while navigating friction with the Trump administration. Chinese ministries say Beijing is ready to deepen cooperation with the UK during the visit, with trade and investment agreements expected as both sides signal an attempt to stabilize relations even as security concerns and geopolitical competition remain in the background. For a better focus, we're joined from Beijing by Dr. Marvin Lee, the PhD researcher at the University of Manchester. Dr. Lee, welcome to In Focus. From Beijing's perspective, is Starmer's no choice between the US and China line reassurance or a negotiation tactic to extract better terms from both sides?
Assalamu alaikum. شكرا لاستضافتي. From Beijing's perspective, it reads as pragmatic realism and also as a carefully worded negotiating posture at this moment. The reassurance element is that London is signaling strategic autonomy in Chinese political language, and this is a refusal to be treated as someone else's front line. Beijing generally prefers counterparts to say we will act based on national interest, not alliance disciplined, because that rhythms room for transactional cooperation. But Beijing will not hear this as a love letter. They will treat it as a baseline opening offer designed to maximize the UK's bargaining space with both Washington and Beijing in the future. The rules Chinese read out will be action-based wherever the UK keeps its security red line stable while reopening low-sensitivity channels on trade, finance, health, and climate change. So in other words, Starmer is saying the golden era language may be gone, but a permanent freeze is too costly for the UK, of course. So let's rebuild a controllable and predictable floor.
Dr. Lee, it is understood why the UK is really making sure it has good economic relations with China, saying China, you can't ignore the second biggest economy in the world, but what about China? What does it want most from this visit? Are we talking about investment access, trade expansion, technology cooperation, or political signaling that the UK is hedging?
I'm sure that we all have read the news about the mega embassy in London. It's quite politically sensitive by some politician in the UK saying that like China may plan to spy the UK's information system, which is quite nonsense from my perspective. So this is the first one. And second, of course, it is all about economic interest between UK and China. And there are lots of Chinese international students studying in the UK, which have been contributing to the British economy from renting a house to paying the tuition fee. So you're right, you're absolutely correct. The UK, the British people should not ignore Chinese economy because Chinese economy is growing stronger and stronger with the highest resilience at this moment.
Well, how does Beijing read the risk of a US retaliation if London or when London deepens its economic ties with China? What pressure points does Washington have?
Beijing reads the risk as high but not necessarily fatal because it assumes London will keep cooperation in non-escalatory lines. The US under President Donald Trump has shown a willingness to use tariff and political pressure even on partners. So Beijing will expect Washington to test the UK with visible warning shot rather than quiet this pressure. So from my perspective, let me share some Chinese wisdom here. So there is an old saying that when the old alliance system are being broken into pieces, and the other side will gain all these members one by one, and even is take a very slower time, which means that China is going to make a positive relationship with the Americans ally, especially Finland, Canada, UK, and even Middle East just to sideline and even marginalize US, because the Chinese government and the Chinese people have very few imagination or or a very pessimistic approach to the future of USA, because it is unstable, or like they cannot provide a optimistic or promising future.
Can the UK realistically balance the security concerns with economic engagement? In other words, how far can the UK push or strengthen its ties with China before pissing off the US? Where's the line likely to be drawn? Critical infrastructure, data, defense supply chains?
I believe that the UK can balance it, but only with a clear two-track approach, and Beijing will watch wherever the line is consistent or political. In Chinese wisdom, one cannot have both fish and beers ponds, which means you cannot take both. In practice, London will try to have both by separating domains straight in critical national infrastructures like 5G communications, rare earth, and defense supply chains, open in commercial sectors where the security argument is weaker. Where the line is likely to be drawn is already visible. Critical infrastructure remains the hardest boundary between both countries because it's where trust is binary. Data is the second boundary, with heightened scrutiny around anything touching national scales, data set, and secure communications. Defense supply chain and dual-use technology are the third, where friend-showing logic dominates and even natural cooperation can be politically attacked.
Well, Reuters frames this as part of Europe reducing its reliance on the US. Is Beijing seeing an opportunity, a temporary hedge, or is it a structural shift in Western alliance system?
From the Beijing perspective, Beijing is really happy to see that Europe reducing reliance on the US, because around 5 and even 7 years ago, the entire Western world, a large part of global North were actually against China. But right now, when they have a dispute within within the global North, China, as I've mentioned before, China has a very optimistic approach to make friends with them, give them economic incentive, have a collaboration with them. It is the Chinese diplomatic logic just to win friends and mind step by step, just to sideline their main opponent.
From Beijing, that was Dr. Marvin Lee, the PhD researcher at the University of Manchester. Dr. Lee, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us. Tonight's takeaway is that middle powers and allies are recalibrating in real time. In Europe, Denmark and Greenland are seeking to lock in support and draw clear red lines on sovereignty while trying to keep the alliance intact. In the UK, Starmer is testing a both-track strategy, staying close to Washington on security while engaging Beijing on economics. The question now is whether these balancing acts will hold or not, or whether the US pressure forces clear choices in the months ahead. I'm Henny Seif. Thank you for watching In Focus, and good night.